The rain came down in sheets, a relentless curtain of grey that blurred the edges of the world. It was the kind of storm that seemed to carry the weight of sorrow, soaking everything it touched with a cold, unforgiving misery. In the dense forests of Oregon, where the pines stood tall and the air smelled of damp earth, the rain was a constant companion. For former Army Sergeant Mark Callahan, it was just another reason to stay inside his small cabin, hidden deep in the woods, far from the clamor of civilization. Mark was a man who preferred solitude. At 38, his broad shoulders and weathered hands spoke of a life spent in service. But his eyes, storm gray and guarded, told a story of loss. His dark hair, streaked with early silver, was cropped close, a remnant of military habit. He lived simply, his cabin a fortress of quiet, furnished with little more than a worn couch, a wooden table, and a fireplace that kept the chill at bay. The only constant in his life, the only thing that tethered him to the world, was Ranger. Ranger was no ordinary dog. A German shepherd with a coat of ethereal gray and white, he looked more like a creature of myth than a pet. His thick fur caught the light in a way that made him seem almost luminous, like a wolf born from the mist. At 6 years old, Ranger's intelligent eyes missed nothing, and his presence was a steady anchor for Mark. They were not master and pet, but partners. Two souls who had learned to rely on each other in the face of unseen enemies. Mark guarded against the ghosts of his past memories of war, of comrades lost, of promises unkept. Ranger guarded Mark. On this particular day, the rain had forced Mark out of his sanctuary. Supplies were running low. Coffee, flour, a few cans of soup, and the nearest town, a small cluster of shops and homes called Pine Hollow, was a 30-minute drive through the deluge. Mark's old pickup truck, a battered relic from the early 2000s, rumbled along the slick road, its wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, his massive form filling the space, his head resting calmly on his paws. He was a steady traveler, content to watch the world pass by. But today, something was different. As they approached the outskirts of Pine Hollow, Ranger stirred. A low whine started deep in his chest, a sound so subtle Mark almost missed it over the patter of rain on the windshield. The dog shifted, his ears twitching, and then he sat up, his paws pressing against the dashboard, with a soft click of claws on plastic. His eyes locked onto something outside, his body tense with alertness. "Easy, boy," Mark muttered, his voice rough from disuse. He reached over, resting a hand on Ranger's back, expecting the dog to settle, but Ranger's agitation only grew. He let out a sharp, insistent bark, a rare sound from a dog who was usually silent, and nudged Mark's arm with his wet nose, urging him to look. Mark frowned. This wasn't a reaction to a squirrel or a stray cat. Ranger was trained, disciplined, a service dog who had served alongside Mark in ways most couldn't understand. This was an alert. Trusting Ranger's instincts over his own desire to avoid the world, Mark slowed the truck and followed the dog's gaze. Through the rain he saw it, a scene that made his chest tighten. A family's life was being thrown onto the wet sidewalk. A heavy-set man, likely the landlord, stood under an umbrella, his face twisted with impatience as he barked orders. A young woman, soaked to the bone, stood shivering, her dark hair plastered to her face, her expression one of utter defeat. Beside her, a small boy no more than 7 or 8 clung to her side, his face buried in her coat, trying to shield himself from the rain and the cruelty of the moment. Mark's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He wanted to keep driving, to let the rain and the road carry him past this misery. But Ranger's whine grew sharper, his paw pressing harder against the dashboard, his eyes fixed on the boy. It was the child's silent suffering that Ranger had sensed, a distress signal cutting through the storm like a beacon. In that moment, something shifted in Mark. The walls he'd built around himself, walls of solitude, of guilt, of avoidance, began to crack. Ranger had given him a mission, and Mark couldn't ignore it. He pulled the truck to a sharp halt at the curb, the tires splashing through a puddle. Without a word, he opened the door and stepped into the rain, the cold water doing nothing to cool the sudden fire of purpose inside him. He strode toward the landlord, his military bearing cutting through the man's tirade like a knife. The landlord faltered, his voice trailing off as Mark's presence filled the space. "That's enough," Mark said, his voice low but carrying an authority that left no room for argument. He turned to the woman and her son, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. "You're coming with me." It wasn't a question. It was a command, born from the signal of his loyal 4-legged soldier. The drive back to Mark's cabin was quiet, save for the rhythmic thud of the wipers and the soft patter of rain. The woman and her son sat in the back seat, wrapped in an old blanket Mark kept in the truck. Ranger sat beside them, his massive form a comforting presence, his eyes flicking between the boy and the road ahead. Mark kept his focus on driving, his hands steady but his mind racing. He wasn't used to company, wasn't used to the weight of other people's pain invading his space, but Ranger's insistence had left him no choice. The cabin came into view, a small, weathered structure nestled among towering pines. Its cedar walls were darkened by years of rain, and a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, a sign of the fire Mark had left burning. He parked the truck and led the woman and her son inside, Ranger trailing close behind. The interior was sparse but warm, the fire casting a soft glow across the room. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the damp smell of rain-soaked clothes. Mark busied himself with the fire, adding logs to coax the flames higher. He wasn't sure what to say, wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between his solitude and the strangers now sitting in his home. The woman sat stiffly in a wooden chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her son, a small boy with dark curls and wide wary eyes, sat on the floor, wrapped in another blanket. Ranger lay on the hearth, his gray and white fur catching the firelight, his presence a calming force in the tense silence. "I'm Mark," he said finally, his voice gruff. "This is Ranger," the woman nodded, her lips trembling slightly. "I'm Alina," she said softly. "This is Leo." Leo glanced up at the sound of his name, his eyes meeting Ranger's. The dog tilted his head, his ears twitching, and for a moment, the boy's guarded expression softened. Mark noticed but said nothing, turning back to the fire. The silence stretched on, heavy as the rain still drumming on the roof. Mark wasn't good with words, hadn't been for years. He'd spent too long alone, too long running from the memories that haunted him. But Ranger, as always, seemed to understand what was needed. The dog rose from the hearth, his movements silent and deliberate, and padded across the wooden floor to Alina. She flinched, expecting a curious sniff or a playful nudge. Instead, Ranger did something strange. He gently pressed the back of her hand with his wet nose, then rested his chin firmly in her palm, his intelligent eyes locking onto hers. He let out a low, contented sigh, as if he'd found someone he'd been searching for. Alina froze, her confusion mirrored in Mark's eyes as he watched from across the room. Ranger was a service dog, trained to be reserved with strangers, a source of calm rather than a seeker of affection. This gesture specific, personal, like a memory brought to life. Mark's heart quickened. He'd seen Ranger do this before, years ago, with someone else. The memory was there, just out of reach, buried in the fog of his past. "Has he met you before?" Mark asked, his voice rough with curiosity. Alina shook her head, her fingers hesitating before resting on Ranger's gray fur. "No, I don't think so. I've never seen a dog like him. He's acting like he knows you," Mark pressed, stepping closer. The dog's behavior was an anomaly, a puzzle that demanded solving. "What's your last name?" "Albright," she said softly, stroking Ranger's head. Alina Albright. The name hit Mark like a physical blow. Albright. A memory flickered, sharp and sudden, like a photograph developing in his mind. He saw David, his friend from the barracks, laughing as he talked about a puppy his family had gotten. "I taught him the best trick," David had said, his grin wide. "He puts his chin right in your hand and just melts. It's his signature move." Mark's breath caught. He looked from Ranger, still resting his chin in Elena's hand, to the faded photo on the mantel, a picture of him and David, grinning in their uniforms, the desert sun behind them. "David," he whispered, his voice cracking. "My friend David. He taught a dog to do that." The name hung in the air, a ghost-given form. Elena's eyes widened, her gaze darting from Mark to the photo on the mantel, then back to Ranger. The connection was impossible, yet undeniable. Her hand trembled against Ranger's fur, and a raucous sob tore from her throat. She hunched over, tears streaming down her face, the dam of grief and exhaustion she'd held for years finally breaking. Ranger didn't retreat. He pressed closer, laying his great head in her lap, his warmth a steady anchor in her storm of sorrow. Mark stood frozen, his own memories crashing over him like waves. David Albright, his friend, his brother in arms, had been gone for 5 years, killed in a roadside ambush that Mark had survived. The guilt of that survival had driven Mark to this cabin, to this life of isolation. But now, here was Alina, David's widow, and Leo, his son, sitting in Mark's home, brought here by Ranger's uncanny intuition. Elena's tears slowed, and, with Ranger's steady presence grounding her, she began to speak. Her voice was soft at first, then stronger. as if the dog's warmth gave her the courage to voice the pain she'd carried alone. She told Mark of the days after David's death, when grief had swallowed her whole. She'd been left with a toddler, a mortgage, and a life insurance policy that was supposed to secure their future. Then her cousin Richard had appeared, all smooth promises and sympathetic smiles. He said he'd handle everything, Alina said, her voice breaking. The insurance, David's savings, all of it. He said it was what family was for, but Richard's promises had been a lie. The money dwindled, excuses piled up, and soon there was nothing left but eviction notices and shame. Elena's voice shook as she admitted why she'd never reached out to David's unit. How could I tell his brothers, the men who fought with him, that I'd lost everything, that I'd failed him? He died to give Leo a future, and I let it be stolen. Mark listened, his own guilt twisting into something new. He'd made a promise to David, a vow to look after his family if anything happened, but he'd buried that promise, along with his memories, believing solitude was his penance. Now, Ranger had brought that promise back to life. This isn't charity, Mark said, his voice firm. This is duty. We're going to fix this. The next morning, Mark was no longer the reclusive veteran. He was Sergeant Callahan again, a man with a mission. He made calls to the veteran network, his voice steady and efficient. By noon he'd connected with Sarah Jenkins, a pro bono lawyer and former Navy officer whose sharp mind and no-nonsense attitude radiated through the phone. She listened to Elena's story and agreed to take the case, but she had a warning. Without the original contracts Elena signed with Richard, it's her word against his, Sarah said. We need a paper trail. Elena's face fell, her voice hollow. They're gone. After so many moves, they must have been thrown away. Mark refused to accept defeat. He rallied two other veterans from his old unit, Tom, a burly medic, with a quick laugh, and Javier, a quiet sniper with a knack for details. Together they drove to the storage facility where Elena's belongings had been dumped. The unit was a bleak sight, a pile of battered furniture and waterlogged boxes. They searched for hours, their hope fading with each empty box. Finally, only one box remained, a damp, taped-shut relic in the corner. It's just junk, Elena said, her voice tired. Throw it away. As Tom moved to discard it, Ranger sprang into action. He planted himself in front of the box, his bark sharp and commanding. His nose nudged the cardboard, his eyes locked. On Mark's it was a signal, unmistakable and urgent. Hold on, Mark said, kneeling beside the box. He ripped it open, digging through baby clothes and photo albums until he found a thick manila envelope. Inside were the documents, signed agreement, bank statements, everything Sarah needed. Elena gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Mark looked at Ranger, who sat patiently, his job done. The dog hadn't just provided comfort, he'd delivered justice. With the documents in hand, Sarah dismantled Richard's lies in court. The legal battle was swift, and Elena recovered a substantial portion of the stolen inheritance. The veteran community rallied around her, helping her find a new apartment. The Morvin day was filled with laughter, as Mark, Tom, and Javier turned the task into a celebration, arguing over who could carry the heaviest box. Weeks later, Mark and Ranger visited the new apartment. It was bright and warm, filled with Leo's laughter as he played with Ranger on a soft rug. Elena emerged from the kitchen, her face radiant with a peace Mark hadn't seen before. He's the guest of honor, she said, smiling at Ranger. Mark watched him, a weight lifting from his shoulders. He'd thought his promise to David was his burden alone, but Ranger had been the heart of the mission. The dog had sensed Elena's distress, bridged the gap of years, and uncovered the truth. The promise had been kept by a team of two. Ranger's story was a reminder that loyalty speaks without words, that our animal companions are often our bravest guides. For Mark, Elena, and Leo, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one built on trust, healing, and the unbreakable bond between a soldier and his dog.